Good evening and welcome to the 2021 Evening of Microlectures here at the Royal Geographical Society. I'm Joe Smith, I'm Director at the Society, and for those of you who don't know us, we are the UK's learned society for geography, and we're also sometimes known as the spiritual home of exploration. By the way, if you're not already a fellow or a member, I encourage you to join. We support students, teachers, researchers, professional geographers and adventurers, whether that's through events, training, access to our extraordinary collections or funding opportunities. We also provide a platform for speakers to tell their stories and inspire others to care about and explore our magnificent world. Now that could be through regular Monday night lectures, which we hold for members through most of the year, through our regional events programme, which since COVID struck have become global events, or events like tonight, where we've got 8 fantastic speakers lined up to cover themes around memory, teamwork, challenge, and the discovery of our own backyards. This is a special one in some ways because the 2020 event was the very last one we were able to hold in the Ondaatje Theatre in our magnificent headquarters building in South Kensington. And since then, we, like virtually everyone else, have been doing things at a distance. So welcome again to this year, but to this year, the first of our virtual micro-lectures. This has been organised by the Society's Younger Members Committee. Thank you very much to all of you involved. We're delighted that once again, the broadcaster and anthropologist, Marianne Ochota, will again be introducing our speakers and so engagingly hosting this event. Please do get involved with questions for the speakers and join the breakout discussions at the end of the event on Zoom. The post-micro lectures of the evening is always a fantastic opportunity to engage with the speakers, swap notes with fellow audience members, and come up with new ideas about your next journey. Now, we can still do that online, and although it's not as good as standing there in our amazing map room with the plaster model of Everest next to you, it's a pretty good second. Now, these are informal talks rather than lengthy academic lectures with a mix of stories from global to local. If I can suggest an overall theme that you might reflect on, look at the title of the night, Geographical Journeys. Another way of talking about what the Society and these talks are all about is purposeful travel. So even if freedom of movement is somewhat restricted, you can still pick up ideas as to how you might use any journey, including a daily local journey, in a way that brings new insight to you and to others. So you may have to satisfy curiosity a little closer to home than normal, but I'm very confident that tonight will inspire you to even make those journeys with added purpose. Over to Marianne.
Thank you, Joe. And hello and welcome to you all to the annual micro lectures. We are obviously online this year, but I promise that you are in for just as much of a treat as any other year. And let's be honest, you can watch this in your pyjamas, perhaps even sitting in bed. Pyjamas have traditionally been frowned upon at the RGS in Kensington. So in any way, it's been The microlectures are an event where new voices are heard and new connections are made, and this year will be no different. It's an evening of thought-provoking travel, inspirational journeys, both close to home and quite far afield. And if you've been craving adventure, like me, let this evening be balm to your soul. We have 8 speakers this evening. They each have just 10 minutes to tell us the story of their geographical journey. And after each talk, I'll ask your questions. So please do submit those during the talk and afterwards in the Q&A box, which is on this same webpage that you're watching me now. But just if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see a box, a tab with Q&A. Type in your questions and they'll come through to us. After the 4th speaker, we'll have a quick 5-minute break, and then we'll be back for our second set of 4 speakers. And then after the talks finish, around 9:15, the Younger Members Committee will be hosting a virtual bar breakout room, or a set of breakout rooms in fact, after the final talk, where we can carry on the conversations. You can meet and talk directly to the speakers and perhaps even cook up some plans for adventures of your own. The links for that will be below, and I'll share them again with you at the end of the evening. So, as Joe pointed out, this is an evening for talking, not lecturing, and it's very much an evening for connecting. So please do ask your questions during at the end of each talk, and stick around for the chat in the breakout rooms at the end of the night. So, without further ado, allow me to introduce our first speaker. Alex McDermott is just 17. He's an accomplished kayaker, a Surfers Against Sewage rep, a former member of the Youth Parliament, and a bona fide researcher. He had been planning to spend the summer of 2020 walking 100 miles around Cornwall, but COVID, understandably, demanded a change of plans and a change of location. So instead of walking, how about canoeing through COVID? So for our first talk of the 2021 RGS IBG Microlectures, please welcome Alex McDermott.
Thank you. Every story has a setting. So I've just brought a video to introduce the setting, to introduce my micro lecture this evening. So that will be playing for you now. And the setting of my story is on the River Severn. In my story, there are 3 heroes: Aidan, David, and Adam. There's also me. My name is Alex McDermott. I'm an A-level student at Ecclesbourne School in Derbyshire. I'm also a former member of UK Youth Parliament, as well as being a rep for Surfers Against Sewage. As well as this, I'm a keen kayaker. Slide. As the first lockdown lifted, I quickly planned a small expedition at short notice. With my A-level geography course coming up a few months later, I thought it would be good to get into the outdoors and do some positive field work at the same time. Slide. So we paddled for 120 miles on the longest river in Britain, from Wales to England. Slide. In my story, there are 4 chapters: people, plants, plastic, and politics. COVID may be seen as the villain of this story, but I wanted to find out if that was true in all aspects. My story is written in English, but the language is geography. So if you're ready, I'll begin. Slide. Chapter 1, people. Slide. Now, people in the River Severn have been linked for a very long time. There are people who live on it, people who work on it, people who play on it, and the people who look after it. And we were interested to see how each of these people had been impacted by COVID. So we interviewed 22 people in all, sometimes on video, sometimes in person. And although COVID is a single virus, we found many contrasting views about its impact on the river. Slide. From Alison, a local at Montfort Bridge and a keen dog walker, who told us that COVID had cleared out the hordes of strangers whose dogs fouled the riverbank. Slide. To her next door neighbour at hireacanoe.com, where idle trailers and empty tents showed a small business devastated by the lack of demand that COVID had created. Slide. From the Severn Motor Yacht Club, where retired grey-haired adventurers were thrilled to see young lads out doing a bit of science. Their very casual attitude towards social distancing, as they welcomed us into the bar, seemed at odds with the guy in a hazmat suit cleaning the boats outside, which hadn't been used since lockdown. Slide. However, at Diglis, the lockkeeper told us that the reduced human activity on the river and underserved fish ladders meant he'd observed greater numbers of salmon. So COVID means many different things for the people of the Severn. Slide. Chapter 2, plants. In contrast to the benefits for the salmon population, we witnessed a negative impact from nature being left undisturbed during lockdown. Slide. So you may have heard of Himalayan balsam, but I hadn't, not until I planned this trip. It's an invasive species, and local organisations have been involved for quite some time trying to reduce its impact. Slide. So the Severn Rivers Trust asked us to locate the balsam on our path, as the Trust had struggled to monitor and maintain the riverbank during lockdown. Slide. So during the journey, we produced a balsam location chart, which we handed over to the SRT. And this introduced me to the idea of citizen science and the huge opportunities that it offers. I'm keen to do more of it in the future, and was thrilled to hear from Paul Rose at the team about it at the RGS Explore conference earlier in the year. I think we're more likely to care for our rivers if we understand and engage with them more. Slide. Chapter 3, plastic. Slide. When I first started canoeing on my local river, the Derwent, I was shocked to see how much plastic was caught in the trees, in the banks, and it motivated me to get more involved. Now, we counted and categorised all the plastic pieces we saw in trees, the bankside, and in the river. Slide. And in total, more than 1,700 individual items, with 735 in one day near Coalport, the largest, embarrassingly, being a kayak. Slide. So that's about macroplastic, but what about the impact that COVID lockdown had on microplastic pollution in the Severn? In 2019, Greenpeace had investigated the microplastics in 13 UK rivers, including the Severn. Slide. Now, we replicated this study in the same 3 locations on the river, using a cheap homemade version of the manta net, slide, which we suspended from bridges, slide, to capture surface microplastics and compare findings after 4 months of lockdown, slide. Now, we found 3 key changes. Slide. Now, this is a biobead. Biobeads are found in sewage works as part of the water treatment process. Slide. We found more biobeads than Greenpeace did, possibly due to the heavy flooding in February, which released poorly contained biobeads from settling tanks into the river. Slide. And this is a nurdle. Nurdles are uniform pieces of plastic used as a precursor to the injection moulding of everyday plastic items. Our results showed there were many more nurdles in July 2020 than in the Greenpeace samples in March 2019. Again, this is perhaps as a result of the significant flooding in February 2020, washing plastic from commercial sites and roads into the river. Slide. Now, this is a plastic fragment. They come from plastic bags, straws, and other such litter sources. The number of plastic fragments that we collected in our nets was much less than in Greenpeace's 2019 study. Perhaps less people out during COVID lockdown meant less littering and therefore less plastic in the rivers. Slide. So changing behaviours, whether river access, single-use plastic, or even biobead containment, is possible, but it needs both political and public support. So for the final chapter, therefore, I was keen to talk to local politicians about what they felt were the key issues of the River Severn. Slide. Chapter 4, Politics. Slide. So we interviewed the MPs for Worcester, Gloucester and Montgomeryshire. Perhaps surprisingly for politicians, they actually all agreed on the same thing. As impact goes, COVID was not the only show in town. With a history of flooding, the River Severn sees regular widespread damage to its surroundings. Slide. Floods were abnormally bad last winter. At Diglis, the waters have passed the 2.8 metre bankfull discharge to reach 5.1 metres high. Slide. MPs told us that Ironbridge had been devastated by floods. Slide. But the usual summer tourism had been crushed by COVID. So the need for government investment in flood defence was essential. It appeared that the impact of flooding on their constituencies was a more serious and longer-term threat than COVID, but had received much less government attention. Slide. So this made me reflect on a similar question at a global scale, comparing the world's enormous response to COVID to the seeming lack of excitement over the existential threat of global warming. Slide. So that is the story of my journey on the River Severn. I was surprised by what we'd found. Some types of plastic have reduced due to less human activity. Salmon at Diglis and swans at Montfort Bridge have benefited, but so has the invasive Himalayan balsam. Rivers people's views are diverse, but it's clear that COVID might not be the number one threat. So, is COVID the villain of this story? Well, what is clear, as pointed out recently by the UN Secretary General, is that the pandemic has created a critical juncture. This presents a fleeting opportunity to make change for good, but we must act now. So, how did the story end? Well, it's up to us. Slide. So campaigns such as Paddle Peak and Clear Access Clear Waters aim to achieve more access to UK waterways so people can understand rivers better and know how to care for them. So, how can you help? Slide. Well, there are two main ways to get involved. Firstly, get your phone out now and sign the Clear Access Clear Waters petition on this website. Clear Access Clear Waters is a British canoeing campaign to support wider access to waterways, because people who are more engaged will want to protect their rivers more. Secondly, why not use the template provided on the Clear Access Clear Waters website to contact your MP? Small changes made in lots of places make a big difference. Slide. So thank you so much for listening, and I've got a few minutes for questions at the very end. Thank you.
Fantastic talk, and what a way to kick off the RGS IBG Micros for 2021. The first question has already come in actually from our audience. How long did this expedition, this project take you?
So we were canoeing 130 miles over 8 days, but the research process has taken longer.
And do you have a plan? How close do you live to the River Severn? Is that your local patch?
No, it's not my local patch. So my local river is the Derwent. I'm from Derbyshire, and so the Severn we had to drive down there, but we were just interested to see how COVID had impacted the situation over in Wales.
Yeah, and what are your thoughts? Having this time now, a few months later, reflecting on how people have responded to COVID, how kind of social attitudes are changing now, do you feel like COVID has put other issues, the existential threat of climate change, the massive challenge of plastics, has that been put on the back burner, do you think? What are your thoughts? How do your peers feel?
Well, in terms of the study itself, which potentially had a direct correlation to human activity because of COVID, we thought in terms of the scientific quality, it was as good as it could be. So in terms of the study itself, we followed the Greenpeace methodology as closely as possible. So using the same size as the manta net and appropriately scaling it up, we were trying to get as reliable data as we could. Although we didn't have the PCR technology or the fancy labs, obviously being off a student budget, we couldn't afford these sorts of things. So instead, we had to identify plastic visually or through tests done by a similar Manchester University study. So in general, I'd say the reliability was pretty good. But ultimately, what really appealed to me here was that you could take such complex science and then take it and conduct it in your own home. So that's what citizen science is all about for me, and that's what I love. And so I think just having the opportunity to do that amongst the pandemic and trying to make some small changes in as many places as we can was really cool.
Yeah, it really resonated with me when you said during your talk that basically we are more likely to care about things that we understand better and, you know, are invested in. And I think that is really where I see the strength of citizen science. Not only does it genuinely add to the research database, it also engages us. It makes us, I guess, acknowledge that we're perhaps part of the problem, but very much part of the solution. And I think that's the real strength of the project that you've talked about, that, you know, obviously you're a super engaged young man and very impressive, but to some extent, if you guys can do it, then it's not stopped, you know, no one's being stopped. It's accessible to all of us. A few more questions coming in. Let me just check. Where did you stay? So give us a few more of the kind of the COVID lockdown logistics of, were you camping on the riverbanks? What was the plan?
So we were camping along the way, staying socially distanced and taking relevant COVID safety precautions. But because we had to be constantly moving, we didn't have the time to replicate the Greenpeace study exactly. So as a result, it was important that we followed the other steps as closely as we could. But I think that there are more ways to get involved other than this. So rather than having to camp directly along the river, as I mentioned, you can sign the Clear Access Clear Waters petitions. You can write to your local MP. So we were just fortunate we were able to be in a situation where we could be on the river and stay on the banks and enjoy the beauty, the natural beauty that we need to work harder to preserve.
Alex, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. And then the website, again, that Alex shared was clearaccessclearwaters.org.uk. So perhaps in the break, don't do it yet, because we've got another talk coming up now. Log on to that, sign your name to the petition, and as Alex says, small actions make a big difference when brought together. So write to your MP, do those litter picks, be vigilant about what plastic use you personally are contributing to. Alex, thank you so much. And
thank you
obviously
very much.
For the audience, you will be able to speak directly to Alex, find out. We did have more questions. I'm sorry you didn't get to all of them. So you'll be able to put them to Alex at the end of the evening in the breakout rooms. Okay, our second talk of the evening. On Saturday, the 26th of April, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Ukraine Soviet Socialist Republic exploded. Many of us will remember the news. Many of us have since seen the haunting images of a deserted, post-apocalyptic townscape poisoned by an invisible killer and abandoned by humanity. Our next speaker was born in 1986 in Ukraine. And she's going to take us to that deserted town and explore whether the Soviet era can teach us anything about living with invisible killers. Please welcome Yulia Savchuk.
Thank you, Marianne, for the introduction, and hi, everyone. I'm going to talk about empty streets, panic, contradictory government statements, but it's not about the pandemic. All of these things already happened 35 years ago. Welcome to Chernobyl. And on the first slide, you can see a map for traveling back in time to 1986. Chernobyl is only 2 hours drive from Kiev. And next to it lies Pripyat, a ghost town, which had a population of 50,000 people, and all were evacuated after the explosion, alongside the neighboring villages, which created around 300,000 people as ecological refugees. The government created the exclusion zone, and it is still restricted for living. So why did I go to one of the most contaminated places on Earth? I was born in Ukraine in '86, so I was only 4 months old when the radioactive cloud traveled across my region. While I was healthy, I still received the Chernobyl kid status, and every year I was going through medical checks. Also, every year I could go to a summer camp for children like me. But my dream was to visit Pripyat. And on the next slide, here I am. I actually visited Pripyat twice, in 2017 and in 2020. My first trip was very emotional. I knew a lot about Chernobyl and I thought I'm mentally prepared. But when I saw empty streets and abandoned schools, this is when you really realize the horror of the evacuation. In my school, we had a couple of children relocated from Chernobyl. And on the next slide, it could be very flat. Thousands of people left in a rush, not knowing they would never see their homes again. My uncle was one of the thousands of civilians liquidating the consequences of Chernobyl disaster. And it was emotional for me. He was a driver transporting God knows what and died 20 years later in his early 50s. Moving to the next slide. It was also very emotional because Pripyat looks very similar to my hometown. You can see a famous Chernobyl Ferris wheel and a Ferris wheel in my town. And guess which one is on the left and which one is on the right. So it's very surreal. It's like coming back to your hometown, which is just abandoned and ghosted. Moving to the next slide. Visiting Chernobyl is also very educational. Many of you might be curious, is it safe? I learned that radiation is not gradually spread. There are very dangerous spots, but tourists only go to safe areas. In fact, this photo was taken near the famous reactor, and the Geiger dosimeter readings are very similar to flying at high altitude. So it is safe if you follow the rules and don't touch anything with your hands. Very similar to today's COVID situation. Next slide, please. You can also see that on your way in and out of the exclusion zone, everyone is required to go through the radiation control checkpoint. You also go through this check every time you visit a local canteen, so every time you want to eat. And I wonder if we will be required to provide any test results every time we visit restaurants in London this summer. In Chernobyl, it was the case since 2011, when the first tourists came in. Next slide, please. And my trip was also a dramatic travel back in time, because you can see streets are clean of commercial advertisement, but full of Soviet propaganda. The government kept people misinformed about the real danger of the explosion, and it damaged the trust of Soviet people in the Communist Party. That's why many experts say that Chernobyl was the final reason for the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ironically, Chernobyl is the only place where Soviet Union is still alive. On the next slide, for example, you can even take a photo with Vladimir Lenin. And there are only 2 remaining Lenins in Ukraine. Both are in the Chernobyl region. So it took me to my childhood when I was surrounded with different symbols of communism. Next picture, please. This is the photo of the entrance to Chernobyl, and I took it during my second visit. My boyfriend, not on the photo, really wanted to see Chernobyl. That's why I came back last year during the pandemic. So now there were 2 invisible killers, COVID and radiation. Otherwise, not many things have changed between my 2 visits. The city is stuck in 1986 forever, but the world has changed. So am I, and I made new observations and I learned new lessons. I learned that more people suffered, not because of radiation itself, but because of fear of radiation. Pregnant women were encouraged to have abortions. Many men started drinking because they thought it's inevitable to die from radiation. Old people, babushkas and dedushkas, they couldn't cope with the separation from their homeland. So Chernobyl taught me that there is another invisible killer, depression, and it shouldn't be ignored, especially today with the pandemic. The next slide, please. And I also noticed that the city is actually very green. It's like a big forest. Nature is taking it back. And there are so many wild animals now. Beavers, eagles, lynx. There are more wolves than even before the explosion. I wonder if radiation is less dangerous than humans. It's amazing how the absence of humans can heal nature. The next slide. And after the lockdown in London, I was less shocked with empty streets and empty shelves in supermarkets. So I noticed some new things. For example, there is no plastic rubbish. You can see debris of glass and metal, but not a single plastic bottle. And I wonder how much chemical rubbish would we leave behind us if we were to abandon the town today. Also, you don't see any advertisement asking you to buy more than you can consume. And customers were using textile reusable bags. Or on the next slide, many children, including myself, were making pocket money by collecting and recycling milk bottles and newspapers. And not only the Soviet Union, the whole world lived without plastic using more sustainable packaging. We just forgot that we can. Or look at the next picture. It's a vending machine selling fizzy drinks like lemonade. You insert a coin, place the provided glass under the dispenser, get your drink, finish it, and return the empty glass. A water spray cleans the glass before the next customer. And I know it doesn't feel right that the whole city is drinking from the same glass. But it's also not right that we pollute the oceans and rivers with plastic bottles. That's why I'm finishing my presentation with the next slide. And it's a non-Chernobyl picture showing a much more global issue affecting every country, not only Ukraine. Chernobyl is changing, recovering with more vegetation and animals. And now 400 people live on the edge of the exclusion zone. And some of these illegal settlers have moved from the conflict zone in the east of Ukraine. It just reminds us that there are more dangerous places, many that require our attention because of social or environmental issues. That's why let's make sure there is not another Chernobyl around the corner. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed my story.
Yulia, thank you so much. Another fantastic talk that takes us to somewhere fresh, thought-provoking. We've already had questions in. The first one from Anthony Hazar. He says the link to mental health is very insightful. Do you think that we or governments need to be more proactive in addressing mental health related to the impacts of COVID? Are we as a society doing enough?
Right, it's a very good question. As you can imagine, in the 90s, there was not much research about mental health in Ukraine or in other post-Soviet countries. And today, I think we have capabilities and we should do more research, because I'm not a scientist, but a lot of anecdotal evidence suggests that people like old people who stayed in the exclusion zone, they actually outlived people who left. So as a society, yes, we should definitely pay more attention to it.
And what were your thoughts about Chernobyl becoming a tourist attraction in some ways? Obviously, this is, the site of probably the worst nuclear disaster that we've ever had. I mean, Fukushima comes a kind of close and tragic second. What are your thoughts on that balance between perhaps it being an opportunity for education, for learning, a memorial to those who lost their lives or lost their life, as they knew it, and it being a kind of a place that people are drawn to, a kind of a dark tourism spot? What were your thoughts on the two visits that you've made?
Yes, it's a good question again, because I visited Chernobyl before the famous HBO Chernobyl series in 2017, and it was much less tourist back then. And in 2020, I was told that sometimes on one day there are 2,000 people in Pripyat, and it's just too much. And I understand that many people, they see that it was a big catastrophe and they take it seriously. It's a serious topic. But when I saw like Chernobyl ice cream or different funny Chernobyl souvenir, it didn't make me laugh.
No, it kind of makes you go, what's wrong with people? What's going on there?
Well, people trying to commercialize, and it's good for educational reasons, but unfortunately, some people just come for fancy pictures.
The next question we've come in, how long were people totally excluded from Chernobyl for before tourists have been allowed back? And what are the processes, if you did want to visit respectfully, appropriately, what do you have to do?
Right. So first tourists came in 2011. So it's 10 years record track. And all you need is your passport and 100 pounds with one of the many Chernobyl tour providers. And that's it. So you just need to notify Chernobyl local authorities one day in advance. But your tour guide will do it for you. So it's very easy, and it's worth visiting if you come to Ukraine with right thoughts.
A question from Sarah. What do you think are the positives that have come from this tragedy? Well, she doesn't specify COVID or Chernobyl. Let's go with Chernobyl.
Right. Positive thing is obviously that it's an example of what human error can do. And after the catastrophe, many nuclear plants were either stopped or refurbished. So ironically, Chernobyl saved a lot of lives as well. And plus a lot of research, especially cancer-related research, was done in Ukraine in 90s and until now. So civilization and foreign scientists, they come to Ukraine and they study this subject.
I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to travel to Chernobyl myself a few years ago to make a documentary. One of the things that we were profiling were the scientists who are doing research on the wildlife populations there, and they're doing things like trialling superfood supplements that help combat free radicals. And they were saying, one of the potential applied uses is to translate that to human treatments for people who were, for example, affected by the Fukushima Daiichi, or even people, undergoing cancer treatment where they're exposed to radiation. Even though it's controlled, obviously it has such massive impact on the bodily system. So perhaps the little shrews and voles that are running around the irradiated poison dust in the forests that are taking over Pripyat may have even greater long-term benefit to humanity. Small wins from a great tragedy. Yulia, thank you so much for your speech, for your talk, and the audience members, thank you for your questions. I'm sorry, again, we didn't get to all of them, but you'll be able to connect with Yulia at the end of this evening. Thank you so much, Yulia. Okay, our third talk. Many of us have them. Some old photos of family members in strange clothes or perhaps far-off destinations. They might intrigue us, yes, but most of us don't make a project or a digital adventure out of them. Well, our next speaker is different. She took some sepia photos in a family album and, with 21st century technology and a keen sense of curiosity, went on a journey with her grandfather to South America and into the past. Please welcome our next speaker, Emma de Henningham.
Hi everyone. I'm going to talk about a journey that began more than 90 years ago when my grandfather, who was 20 at the time, fell out with his father and ran off to South America. And this was a very unexpected story that my dad first told me when I was a child about the grandfather who died before I was born. And so it was always really frustrating to get this glimpse of an adventure but not be able to find out any more about it. On the next slide, you'll see the only clues that we had, which were just a small collection of quite faded photographs with some basic captions. And we looked for these places in a printed atlas at that time, but we could never find any trace of them. So it really felt like a mystery. And if someone had told me all that time back that, one day I would be able to pinpoint where these photographs had been taken, I just wouldn't have thought that could be done. But fast forward to the next slide. And 2017, and that's exactly what I set out to do. I couldn't go to South America myself for 2 more years, so all I can do is retrace his footsteps on my fingertips across a kind of flat version of the Earth, hopping between these islands of data, in particular, things like shipping records and satellite images, and of course, archive photos and documents. And slowly but surely and very painstakingly managed to piece together on the next slide a skeleton timeline of his journey, starting with a shipping record where he sailed from Liverpool to Iquique in northern Chile in early 1928, and then moving into Peru in the early 1930s, and finally sailing back home again towards the end of 1938 via New York. But what I really wanted to know was, why has he chosen these particular places and what was he doing there? I wanted to know more about the stories behind this skeleton timeline. On the next slide, you can see 4 photographs that I decided I would focus in on. So first of all, I was trying to locate the place called Oficina Centro Lagunas, the place where you can see a cricket match with quite a grand looking building in the background. Secondly, I wanted to know where Cartavio was, and there were 2 buildings I was searching for here. The top one with a group of people on some quite distinctive curved steps, and then underneath the picture of a strike happening in front of a hospital. And then lastly, there was one picture of 2 men standing in front of a train at a place called Casa Palca. And I didn't know where that was. I wanted to find out more if I could. Now, first of all, finding something about Cartavio turned out to be relatively straightforward because it's a huge sugar plantation in the north of Peru, and it's still operating today. And those strikes that my grandfather had photographed in the early 1930s were quite well documented. But trying to find Oficina Centro Lagunas just completely defeated me for a long time, until I realized that the Spanish word oficina has another meaning. And on the next slide, you'll see two examples of the old saltpeter mines. Now, these sprang up in this whole chain through the Atacama Desert towards the end of the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century. Now, saltpeter was a key ingredient in fertilizer and in gunpowder, and it was an absolutely booming industry at this time. And many of the people who controlled it were British and American so-called nitrate barons, and they were centered in the town of Iquique. So suddenly the timeline starts to fall into place, and I realized that my grandfather hasn't just closed his eyes and stuck a pin in a map to choose where to go, to where to run away to. He's actually gone here with an intention to find work. He'd trained as a clerk in London, and he'd obviously, I think, from finding more documents later on, he must have already had that work when he set off on his journey. And whole towns, you can see on the left image there, whole towns sprang up around these mines with their own schools, their own shops, even in some cases their own theatres and swimming pools. They're quite incredible places. And for my grandfather working in the office, and as you just saw, playing cricket, he probably had a relatively comfortable life there. But of course, for the mine workers, this would have been just an incredibly difficult place to work. On the next slide, you get a bit of a sense of just how dry and how remote this area is. You can see the satellite image there of the area around Centro Lagunas. And also in the next image, hopefully that will come up in a second, this is from street view. So I could even pace up and down the Pan American Highway, which runs through this area, and see a little bit what it might have been like for my grandfather. If we go to the next slide, and if we can keep going through, so all three images are showing, thanks. So now I was looking in Cartavio for the hospital building. And again, I was relying very much at this stage of the journey just on street view and satellite images. And I didn't have any idea where in the town the old hospital building was. So this was literally a case of doing a street by street search, following that infuriating blue line to try to find the building I was looking for, which eventually I did see. But very, very frustratingly, shortly after that, I discovered that it only recently was demolished. But then I realized, actually, I'm on a virtual journey here, and I can still stand in front of this building in the spot where my grandfather took that photograph of the strike. And it's still there. If you look today, the building still exists in this kind of digital suspended animation until the next time the street view cameras go through the town. And on the next slide, you'll see the picture with the curved steps on the veranda. And I had to find a photograph of what the whole building looked like in this case, because I couldn't spot it in the town just through looking through the street view images. So once I found this picture on the next slide, I could finally spot the building on the left, in the left two pictures there, just peeking out above a perimeter wall, which apparently has been built because of more recent strikes at the sugar plantation. And just in the same way that you see things when you're on a journey on the ground that are interesting, I noticed this red and yellow building, and when I zoomed in, I saw it was a sports club that would have been there when my grandfather was in town. And I got in touch with them via Facebook, and on the next slide, suddenly I'm hearing stories about the people that my grandfather would have lived and worked with, which were the kind of connections I just didn't think would be possible. So we managed to identify one of the men standing on the steps in that photo on the left. I was hearing stories about the First World War American pilot who would have been my grandfather's boss. And I even found out some information about Max, who appears in that photograph with the horses. And all of this without even stepping foot in South America. In fact, it was the only reason why, when late in 2019, I actually traveled to South America, I had the first idea where to start. If we can go to the next slide. So William arranged for me to meet people from Cartavio. And in Centro Lagunas, I met these two wonderful local historians who arranged the special permission I needed to explore some of these mining sites. And they really are very ghostly places today, completely abandoned in the 1930s and just strewn with rubble, no sign of that big building. And in the same way there were schools and there were shops at the mines, there were also cemeteries. And you can see one on the next slide. And you see these as you drive through the area. There's absolutely, almost one for every single mine, which is this really very powerful reminder of the scale of the saltpeter boom. And on the next slide, the photo I haven't yet spoken about, the railway. Well, this turned out to have been taken on what was then the highest railway in the world. It starts in Lima at sea level, and it rises up to more than 5,000 meters in the central Andes. And it's still possible to go on this railway. When I turned up to the station, I found bizarrely a television crew there. And on the next slide, you'll see that I told them a little bit about my grandfather's story. And before I knew it, I was appearing on Peruvian television, clutching his photograph. And just to put this into context, the first demonstration of a television set took place just a couple of months before he'd set off from Liverpool in 1928. And I really wondered, what would he think of this strange virtual world where I could walk down the same streets that he'd known and even sort of get to meet some of the people that he would have been living and working with. And on the final slide, I think probably what was most surprising to me about this project was that in quite a small number of pictures, he'd actually managed to capture some really historic moments in South American history, these booming industries, these pioneering forms of transport, and also political events, because those strikes in and around the sugar plantations in the early 30s turned into a revolution in 1932 that only ended when the central government bombed the nearby city. And then shortly after that, my grandfather was heading back to England, 4.5 years since he'd run away. So it turned out that his stories weren't completely lost. And in fact, what I did discover was that so many documents and images are being uploaded to the internet every day. There's actually a really good chance that perhaps even more of his stories might emerge, given just a bit more time. Thank you.
Oh, Emma, that was ace. Thank you so much. What made you have the idea in the first place to kind of undertake this digital adventure?
I suppose it was the restriction of not being able to travel there myself. But I think ever since I first heard that story, I was quite intrigued by it. And I wanted to, know where he'd been and get a sense of what he'd been up to. And I think it was really important to do the research that way, because as I said, I kind of had a whole continent to start with. I didn't really know anything about where he'd been at all. So it was really the only way to go about retracing the steps, because otherwise, I literally wouldn't have known where to start.
Yeah. And what happened to your grandfather when he came back to the UK? Did he kind of make peace with the family and settle back into being a clerk, or did his adventures change him?
The adventures continued. So he was in England, I think, for a few more years. And then he travelled to South Africa. He actually met my grandmother on the boat on the way to South Africa, and then came back to England at the end of the Second World War. So he was a bit of an adventurer, and it wasn't his only adventure.
I feel like you've inherited those traits, I'm sure.
Yeah, it makes a bit of sense.
A question is from Fran. What's next for you to research? Do you have your sights set on a next project?
Well, I kind of feel like there's more to find out on this one as well. So I haven't really stopped with this one just yet. But yeah, I would quite like to do some research into my grandmother, because obviously, as I said, she was on a boat to South Africa, and it wasn't the first time she'd been travelling as well. So I found quite a few shipping records with her sisters and her sister and her family, but also on her own. So I think that would be a nice thing to look at next.
Yeah, I love this. Another question. Did you find yourself going down lots of rabbit holes and tangents of interest? So I guess either kind of dead ends and red herrings, or, I wasn't expecting this to be kind of intriguing, but you kind of spend a few weeks or months or perhaps days or hours investigating.
definitely a lot of rabbit holes. I think that was probably the most frustrating thing. But then you do sometimes end up on a lead that takes you somewhere that you weren't expecting. So yes, it took an awful lot of patience, and I made quite a few mistakes. To begin with, I thought the cricket photo was taken in Peru. I didn't have all of the captions. It was a case of kind of finding out a little bit, thinking I'd made progress, then realizing it was a mistake and backtracking. So yeah, it sounds more linear when you describe it like this in 10 minutes, but of course it wasn't quite like that in reality.
Tim says that extraordinary picture of the people kind of peering into the gap, sitting on horses. Did you find out where that was taken? What is that feature?
Yes, so that was on the sugar plantation. Actually, it's a really huge area. There were a number of different families that owned the businesses. It's sort of quite near the Pacific coast, and they were all irrigation channels. So I think my grandfather and the man Max, who was in the photo as well, were out kind of checking the irrigation channels around the plantation, which stretched over obviously, a really huge area. I'm sure they were also having fun out riding around, but supposedly checking on irrigation.
Fantastic. And a final question, I think. Is the cricket pitch still there? If not, what's it used for now?
So it's not. It was really difficult to distinguish exactly where it would have been because, as I said, there's just kind of rubble everywhere. And the area is still under control of a mining company. It's not actually actively mined for saltpeter anymore. That kind of went completely bust in the early 20th century. But you still see all the kind of old evaporation pits from all the nitrate processing and then rubble of walls. If you scrape the soil, you find lids of kind of 1920s tins and, it's all sorts of kind of strange debris. But it's hard to really distinguish exactly where that big building was. I mean, it was a huge building, but you wouldn't really know exactly where it is. You just know that that's the site where it used to be.
Emma, thank you so much for sharing this tale with us. We look forward to future updates. And for the audience, thank you for your questions. And of course, you'll be able to catch up with Emma in the breakout rooms at the end of the evening. Thank you again, Emma. Okay, so our final speaker for this half of the evening, just before the interval, is an anaesthetist who works in a hospital in London. He's also a seasoned adventurer, and in 2017, he became the youngest person to complete an unsupported traverse of Antarctica. What do the two experiences of extreme expedition and a modern intensive care unit have in common? Well, they both put you at the sharp end of life and at the very limit of what humans can survive. Please welcome Dr. Alex Brazier.
Tonight I'm going to take you on a bit of a psychological journey and compare the experience of a polar expedition I was fortunate enough to be on a few years ago to that of working in intensive care throughout the pandemic. Hopefully give you an insight into what it's been like for the medical staff sort of on the front line. I'll start by playing a quick video clip from the expedition and then go on to tell you more about COVID ITU. You can play the video.
So we are on our last leg on day 41. We are skiing to the pole. It is Christmas Day. It's been a rough few days. The extra weight we picked up at the pole has been hard work. The surface is fairly thick snow.
very lucky to be on this expedition, and it was a journey that kind of really pushed us to our limits, but one in which ultimately we were successful. And at the end of it, if you'd asked me kind of what the recipe was to resilience or working in a small team under pressure, I'd have said, well, it's easy. You carefully select the right team, you train and prepare them extensively, take your task and break it down into small chunks, and then just keep putting one foot in front of the other, and eventually you'll kind of reach the finish and get to the goal. However, fast forward to last year, and I found myself working in ITU in a sort of major London teaching hospital. And again, working in an environment that felt very similar to being on that expedition, working long hours, wearing PPE, masks, and sort of conditions that made me think back to my time in Antarctica. Except this time, the game seemed completely different. With the polar expedition, we'd known what we were up against. We knew where the finish line was. We trained and planned, prepared extensively. Whereas with COVID, things were very different. We didn't know very much about the virus. We didn't know how to treat it. We were ill-equipped and sort of poorly prepared. And actually, there was no real end in sight. Slide. My first experience with coronavirus was in February of last year, and I was called to see a lady called Margaret on a medical ward. She'd come back from a cruise in the South China Sea and had developed quite a nasty pneumonia. At this point, COVID was just really something you read about in the news, and she had had a swab and it had come back as negative, and I was called to see her because she was kind of deteriorating. I was quite concerned that she might have COVID, as were the doctors looking after her, and word quickly spread around the ward that there might be a patient with coronavirus. This caused absolute panic, and patients were soon sort of shouting and screaming, packing their bags and trying to leave the hospital. There was one man who sort of dramatically pulled his cannula out, sort of spreading blood across the corridor, and even a member of staff appeared to sort of quit and walk out mid-shift. Slide. Within a few weeks, we were absolutely inundated. South London, where I work, was the sort of epicenter of the first wave of the pandemic. And it wasn't unusual for us to get, 10, 15 admissions in a day. And admitting someone to an ICU is not as simple as sort of putting them on a fancy bed and switching on a ventilator. It's a really complicated process where you have to sort of put someone in a medically induced coma. You put in lines that sort of sit in their arteries and their heart and monitor them beat by beat. And deliver kind of quite difficult treatments that require a lot of equipment and specialist expertise. Slide. Now, in the polar expedition, we sort of very carefully calculated every gram of food and fuel that we needed day by day, with every item of kit that we'd need for any eventuality. Whereas with COVID, this was the opposite. We were desperately short of everything from sort of beds, drugs, equipment, staff, and even oxygen. Slide. Something you take for normal in a hospital is, you turn on the oxygen tap on the wall and it comes flowing out, and this just wasn't the case. This is seen in the hospital I work at the moment, where at one point we surged up to sort of 130% of our normal oxygen capacity, which almost caused a kind of total oxygen failure scenario, which would involve losing oxygen to hundreds of patients around the hospital, potentially causing a lot of sort of death. And this is a scene you never really want to see, of oxygen being plugged into the wall rather than coming out of it. So a sort of panic rush that day to get people out of the hospital in ambulances to other hospitals, or to switch down as much oxygen as possible. Slide. For me as an anaesthetist, one of the jobs I was doing in this way was sort of anaesthetizing patients who were coming in critically unwell. And this is something that's technically quite challenging. They come in generally very blue, short of breath, very clinically unstable, and you have to be quite quick and use quite powerful drugs, the ones that you can see there. To me, actually, I didn't find that too bad. I almost quite enjoy the sort of challenging intubations, but the hardest part was the conversations you'd have with them. We knew from the first wave that the majority of people wouldn't survive being put onto a ventilator as a treatment of last resort. And so you'd have this sort of strange moment where you'd sort of bring people back with sort of 100% oxygen, and you'd chat to them, and you want them to know that this could be the last chance that they have to kind of speak to someone or send a text message. But at the same time, you don't want to scare them, and you try and sort of reassure them you're going to take good care of them. But certainly over time, having these conversations sort of day after day can become quite haunting. Slide. The work in ICU was absolutely flat out. We were sort of learning about the disease as we went along, and we were desperately short of staff. Because of the increasing number of patients, we were opening ICUs all over the hospitals, and the people who did have the relevant experience and training were spread like butter over a sort of ever-growing piece of bread, working longer and longer hours, 60, 80, 90 hours a week. And most of our patients were sort of between the ages of sort of 30 and 60. Any one of them would have been your sickest patient on a normal ICU, typically starting with pneumonia and getting sort of multi-organ failure. And as a team, we sort of found ourselves working on adrenaline and sort of bouncing from patient to patient, new admissions, medical emergencies, cardiac arrests. It was a really sort of stressful environment to work in. And even sort of going home, you'd find yourself lying in bed, sort of your heart rate throbbing in your ears, sort of thinking of your patients and waking up in the night to answer bleeps that didn't really exist. Slide. One of the real challenges in all of this was isolation. Now, in the Antarctic, we've been very isolated. We've been a long way from home, only able to communicate over sat phone maybe once every couple of weeks. But we still had each other, and we were in tents at night, able to kind of cook and chat. Whereas for patients who are admitted to hospital with COVID, their families weren't able to come and visit them. So often they'd come into hospital with a cough, and then the families wouldn't see them for several weeks until either they'd discharged or passed away. And that was really tough. Normally families come to ICU and they're able to see how unwell people are. They can see all the equipment around the bedside and see just how sick people look. And that helps them to come to terms with what's going on. And in this case, it just wasn't possible because of the risk to them. So each day we'd try and call them to tell them any updates or what was going on. And it was quite tough. Sometimes you'd have families telling you about what was going on at home or the sort of children that they were looking after. You'd have people kind of arguing or bargaining with you. Perhaps they didn't believe in coronavirus or, they were in denial about what was going on. Even sometimes accusing you of kind of negligence or harm, which is pretty hurtful when you're working as hard as you can. And it definitely takes its toll. For me, the hardest part of the whole piece was sort of telling patients' families that, the worst had happened, their loved ones had passed away. And you find yourself making these phone calls at sort of 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, trying to kind of clear the lump in your own throat so you can get the words out clearly enough so that they can understand. Slide. And this emotional component of the sort of ITU coronavirus experience is what made it so much tougher than sort of any kind of polar expedition or sort of physical challenge. For me, it was the sort of impact of dealing with so much death that affected me the most. I remember one patient I looked after, he was a really lovely man. I'd spoken to him a few times before he'd been sort of put onto a ventilator and put to sleep. And he'd been a musician. He played at Live Aid. And there's this incredible scene where the musician he's playing for introduces all of his sort of band by name. The nurses looking after him had discovered that this was the case. And so one night as he was dying, they'd got this recording of this concert and they played it to him for several hours over the period of time while he died, which was just the most amazing thing for them to have done. And I got home, it must have been about 5 or 6 weeks into the pandemic, and sat in the bath and played this music. And for the first time, really just kind of broke down and cried and cried and cried, having up till then really just, sort of tucked it away and put it to the back of my mind. Slide. Throughout this whole process, the support we received from the public was absolutely overwhelming, from kind of amazing baskets of food and everlasting supply of chocolate to sort of letters of support and drawings from children in primary schools. It really just wowed us. Slide. But the thing that was most amazing was the team that we worked with. The guys that worked in ICU were a motley crew drawn from all over the hospital, many of whom had never set foot in ICU before, often well out of their depth, students that have been promoted to working as nurses, people working at levels they were not normally used to. And they were absolutely phenomenal. I was kind of constantly blown away by the compassion and the strength that they showed day by day, whether it's kind of whimsical quotes on the board or kind of celebrating each discharge that we had. We really kind of bonded and found a way through all of it. My kind of thoughts afterwards was that resilience is really such a team sport. Without the kind of team and everyone looking after each other and everyone sort of working their hardest, there's just no way as individuals you could get through this process, particularly when you're dealing with so much sort of suffering and unhappiness. And I've often thought sort of prior to this that, resilience was like being on a sort of polar expedition. It's about individuals in remote parts of the world, up against the elements, working, a great sort of physical adversity. And actually, I don't think that's true. Sort of, if you ask me now what real resilience looks like, I would tell you that resilience is, maybe a slightly overweight nurse in her 50s who leaves her family behind at home and goes to work in, a unit where she knows the disease she's treating could well kill her if she catches it, and does it day after day, not because she's getting any reward or because she'll get any extra pay, but just because she doesn't want to let the team down and she's there to do her bit. the experience of working in ITU definitely humbled me and was something that I'll certainly never forget. Thank you.
Wow, Alex, thank you. That was very powerful. Questions in from the audience. How do you think the experience of the COVID pandemic, which obviously we're not out of yet, how will it guide your future adventures outside the hospital? How do you think it's changed your perspectives on those?
I think I definitely enjoy working within a team, and whilst it's tempting to try and do sort of individual things that maybe receive more praise or higher accolades, there's something really special about creating a brotherhood of people. And that was something I both loved in the Antarctic, but also really found special in the COVID pandemic. You build such strong friendships when you're in that sort of crucible of intense emotion or being sort of up against the elements. And so I'd certainly, whichever trips come up in the future, look to do them with other people rather than doing them by myself.
A question from one of the audience members: what support are you all getting for your mental health, given the challenges of that, the constant work that you're having to do? I've heard the phrase moral injury, where you know the enormousness of what you're trying to do, and it's just the constant like the pain for you of not being able to do everything perhaps that you could because resources are stretched. What are you expected to rely on your own resources and that team spirit, or are you having support and the right help from outside?
I think the hospitals have been pretty good about providing kind of counselling services and sort of psychological support services to people who pursue them, whether or not they are widely kind of taken up. I think often it's easy to feel as though your experiences or your problems are less significant than other people that you work with. So it'll be interesting, I think, down the line to see how this affects. There's a whole generation of kind of healthcare workers, particularly critical care workers, who will have a really tough time kind of adjusting to normality after this experience. So hopefully we do get this. I think the support is there, but people just need to access it.
It is one of the things that people coming back from extreme expeditions that require isolation, a totally different way of being, have, you know, that kind of decompression time, the kind of the black dog as you readjust to normal life. What do you see, I mean, looking into the crystal ball, what do you see in terms of the future? How does an ICU, intensive care unit team readjust to what the normal's going to look like? And do you have any sense of when that might be, when normal starts again?
Oh, that's the golden question. I don't. That's a really tough question. When we got back from the Antarctic, we spent 2 weeks in a Chilean hotel, just eating and sleeping and doing nothing else. And it was a very difficult process coming back to the UK and suddenly remembering how to cross a road and being bombarded by emails and text messages and all the things we got away from. And that period of decompression was really important. And I think one of the things that we will find hardest as a profession is that even though the second wave thankfully has calmed down, most patients where I work, at least ITU, is a lot better than it was a month ago. But now there's a big backlog of other work that needs to be done, and all the usual diseases haven't gone away, and so it's going to be very difficult for people to get real decompression. I think a lot of people will probably take time out, and personally, I'm going to take a year out of medicine come August because I need a bit of a break. But not everyone has that luxury, so I think they'll have to find a way to give staff the time they need.
Yeah. And a question in from Joe, the director of the RGS. Where would you send the Prime Minister or President to learn the most useful lessons about leadership? An ICU ward or a very long walk in Antarctica?
Definitely to an ICU ward. I think a day in ICU would not be wasted seeing how hard people work and also some of the challenges that they really face. It's very difficult from what you sort of read about or see in the headlines, which is partly why I wanted to sort of share the experience tonight.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for your honesty and sharing with us your experiences. We had lots of questions in about the Antarctic trip, how you planned for that, how you trained for that, what you took. So I'm sorry that we didn't get to those. Please do stick around until the end of the evening and you'll be able to hopefully collar Alex. I think he might have to go to work. He's never off duty. But hopefully he'll be here. Otherwise, we might be able to connect with someone else who has Antarctic experience. So please do stick around till the end of the evening. Alex, thank you again so much. Okay, folks, we have now got a 5-minute break, and it's a tight 5 minutes. So I will put you on the clocks. By my watch, it is 2014. So I would like you back in your chairs, perhaps refresh drinks with a loo break under your belt at 20. Come on, Marianne, do the maths. Let's call it 2020. Because that'll make it simple for everyone. So I'll see you at 8:20 back here for 4 more amazing RGS IBG micro lectures. See you shortly.
Three things that geography mean to you.
Oh, 3 things.
Okay.
Okay, 3 things. What did other people say?
I guess I really like field work. So I really like going to places, looking at how people are affected by their environment, and how people are affecting their environment, and geography is a good way to do that.
It's brilliant. It covers a lot of things. It's a very diverse topic, so I found that always kept my interest alive.
The actual part of geography is that of human beings, of how we have moved from one place to another and how we've found ways of creating civilizations. It's so many of these things, but it's also the range of things you can do with a career or with a background in geography.
I think it can give me a very broad view of the world and how the politics and social development are connected to the environmental problems.
Different cultures has definitely been a big part of what I enjoy. Just seeing different ways that people live, different perspectives, what they want to get out of life, and how they've transitioned into careers.
Chose geography to start with because I thought it approached difficult questions in a kind of multidisciplinary manner. So you don't have to be focused on moving straight from university into that dream job. I think that there are ways to get to where you want to go through different experiences.
Food, environment,
Critical thinking,
Justice,
Traveling,
diversity,
development,
migration.
Just surprising.
People, places, identities.
Hello, are you back? Did you get a drink? Did you go to the loo? Settle down, quiet at the back. No rustling sweet wrappers, thank you very much. We're going to get started again. If you are new to the micro lectures, I'm sure you'll agree this is an ace evening. I love the breadth. I've been so lucky to be involved as the host for a number of years now. I love the breadth of the talks that we hear from, the perspectives, the varied talking points. And I think for me, the micro lectures, as a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, the thing that really inspires me is that the micro lectures really demonstrate the breadth of geography as a subject. I always had an experience, I guess, when I was doing my GCSEs, that geography was mostly about talking about tourism in the Lake District and colouring in pictures of volcanoes. Turns out it's much better than that. I know. Sorry, apologies to my former geography teacher. I possibly just wasn't listening in the other lessons. Okay, let's get started. Welcome back to the second half of the RGS IBG 2021 micro lectures. We have 4 more talks in this half, and then we will open the Zoom breakout bar rooms where you can get another drink and chat to our speakers directly, and to each other, of course. Our 5th speaker is taking us to the jungles of Central America. As geographers, or more broadly perhaps people interested in the world, you've probably already given quite a lot of thought to the benefits and perils of an increasingly globalised world. Opportunity often arrives hand in hand with threat. Identities and priorities change as lifestyles do. But once you've identified these complexities, as a geographer, as a local, as a world citizen, what do you then do? Our next speaker travelled to the jungles of Belize to explore just that, and she's calling in this evening from an island in the far remote South Atlantic Ocean, so hopefully the connection will hold up. Please welcome Charlotte Ostwick.
Hello, Voices of the Maya, Discovery and Language in Belize. Next slide. So the expedition took place, next slide. So the expedition took place in Belize in the South Toledo district, which is in the centre of your map, and it says the lowlands of the Maya. And I wanted to show you this map here because it showed you the geographic area of the Maya, because there's not just one language, not just one Mayan language. So there's Yucatec Maya, which tends to come from Mexico. There's Mopan Maya, which comes from Belize, and there's Quechua Maya, which comes from the Guatemala area. And this expedition took place in a small village called Aguacate, which was surrounded by the Maya Mountains. Next slide, please. The research aims and the objectives were to preserve and protect Quechua and Mopan Maya. So they are currently 2 indigenous languages which are on the brink of extinction due to globalization and also English becoming more prevalent in the country. We also supplied the school with more educational resources. We explored a cave to see if there was ancient Maya habitation in it. We also delivered dental hygiene workshops, and we worked with members of the community so they had a great understanding about their ancestry. So in order to do this, in order to protect this language, it was a very long process. And what we did to begin with was we went to the school and we asked the children to speak to their grandparents, their elders, about any myths, about any legends of Aguacate which they might know about, so we could preserve those in Maya. So stories about the Maya in Mayan. And in a moment, I'm going to show you a little short clip of what Quechua Maya sounds like. And what the woman is talking about is she's talking about a myth called birdcage, which is, they used to believe this great big phoenix would come down and take you away. And so they used to make these bird cages on top of their heads so that the phoenix would take that instead of the person. So in the next slide, please.
Where is their house?
Oh, and
Keep the chip. Come on, the chip. What the chocolate chip pinta? Come on, the knock and enough. There's a to do that. Not the kids come back chocolate. When
Excellent. So once we had these stories, we had to work on writing them down. And because Maya is not spoken in the school, it's English. English is the business language of Belize, so we have to learn English in the school. They had to write them down, and they wrote them in English. And in this picture here, I'm helping a girl with her grammar, and she's writing a story about a local sinkhole where legend had it that a giant's footprint made this huge hole in the ground. We worked really closely with the school. We also got involved in drama and music lessons and one-to-one tuition with some of the students who were going to take exams. They were really welcoming, and the children wrote some incredible stories. We chose 5 stories to be translated. Obviously, they were all wonderful, but in the end, we chose 5 differing ones. Next slide, please. Before you can read Maya, you have to know the alphabet. And so whilst we were there, we were asked by the head teacher of the school to create a Quechua Maya dictionary. This was a long process, which took a lot longer than we thought it was going to take, because we needed to choose words which young children could say, but were not abstract words, so they weren't feelings, they were objects, such as hap, which means water, or ix, which means pepper, for example. And then we would work with mothers and the young children in the village to devise this dictionary. It was very successful, and I can't wait to publish it. Next slide, please. This is Shalona Blanco, and she was my teammate. She's a wildlife conservationist and illustrator, and her job on the expedition was to teach the children, teach other members of the community about how to draw art illustrations. And here, you're very, very lucky. This is an exclusive, never been seen before. The top picture is cacao, and the bottom picture is ix for pepper. So both of those will be going into the dictionary. Next slide, please. We wanted to make sure that this project was interdisciplinary, and we didn't just work with the school children. We also worked with members of the women's group there, and you can see here they had these wonderful arts materials which were supplied at a discounted rate by the works. And just in the bottom corner is a drawing of the sesamead, and the sesamead was this big hairy monster that would come and take women away from the river if they went down by themselves. And they had all these myths, you know, don't go down to the river by yourself, otherwise the sesamead will come and take you. They really enjoyed it because very rarely do they get to have experiences like this. Next slide, please. This is the children at the school doing the artwork. They didn't want to do it on the desks because they were a bit messy. So there was lots of painting on the floor, not to get artwork on the desks. And then Shalona helped to teach these. She also did drawings and chalk with some of the younger years as well. Next slide. Now came the hard bit. So we have the illustrations and we have the stories in English. Now we need to translate them into Mopan and Quechua, but there's one problem. I couldn't speak it. They didn't know how to write it. So many, many evenings were spent like this, with me in the hammock, with my laptop, talking with the Maya. This happens to be a Maya homestay family that I stayed with. I'm telling them what it means in English. They're telling me what it means in Maya, and we're using this dictionary to try and work out how to spell it. But luckily, the headmaster came to the rescue towards the end of the expedition, and he made sure that all our grammar was correct. Next slide, please. Mopan Maya is spoken by approximately less than 10,000 people in the world. So in this picture here, me and two of the very few Mopan Maya speaking members of the community are using this weighty dictionary by Charles Andrew Hoffling, which probably took up most of my baggage allowance on the way to Belize. And we're using this dictionary the same as we did with the Quechua, many evenings spent trying to translate these words into Mopan. These two people in this picture actually happen to be some of our tour guides for some of the other parts of the expedition, such as the walking in jungles and exploring the caves. So they were pivotal to the whole expedition. Next slide, please. Here we are towards the end of the expedition. There we are with our tour guides. We just swum through Blue Creek Cave with waterfalls inside, and it was absolutely incredible. So we're looking very hot and wet in that picture. And also flying the Scientific Exploration Society's flag, who helped support the expedition and fund it, and were absolutely incredible. So next slide, please. The results, what did we actually achieve on the expedition? We translated 5 stories into Quechua and Mopan Maya about Mayan life, illustrations done by the Maya to accompany these stories, a Quechua Maya dictionary, archaeological evidence to support the need for further investigation, improved dental hygiene, and anthropological and film footage and photography of them speaking Quechua Mopan and also of the Mayans' daily life. Just would like to say thank you to the Young Explorers Committee for this opportunity, and thank you to everyone else for listening.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Okay, so first comment from our audience. It's fantastic that you can zoom in to this meeting to deliver a talk from the other half of the world, and we've got audience members in Australia who set their alarm at 4:30 in the morning so that they could join in. So that is one of the benefits of doing online and virtual events. So thank you to the internet for making this all possible. A couple of questions in terms of the audience wanting to kind of follow up, I guess, and get more involved with the work that you did. When can we expect the stories and the dictionary, and where can we go to watch the film?
So overall, I should say the expedition, it was a great success. We achieved a lot more than we were expecting to, and the books are actually going to be published later this year. They were supposed to be published last year, and I was hoping to go back to the community this year, but because of COVID, that all got delayed. But I do have the digital copies, so very soon to be published. And the way you can find out about them is I have a website, which is just www.charlotteostwick.co.uk, so that will keep me updated. And also on social media, just Charlotte Ostwick. I will keep you updated on how to get a copy.
Fantastic, thank you. Oh gosh, you've got loads of questions. What were in the caves, and what did you discover in there? Or what were the caves?
Okay, so yeah, the caves are interesting. So in order to do any proper archaeological investigation in Belize, you need to have a permit. So we were just there on purely a looking basis. We didn't take anything. We just looked. Yeah, we found some ancient Maya pottery. We found evidence where things had been removed as well. So one of the caves that we went to had actually been studied previously, and we saw where graves would have been in the cave and where pots would have been in the cave. We did see some other secret stuff, but you're going to have to wait for that one.
And then a question about the relationship between the Maya populations of Belize and the kind of the national government. What is that relationship like?
They have, it's quite good actually for the indigenous populations in Belize. They have their own territory, and it's mapped out as their own territory. So all the individual villages will have their own space, and then it's down to the leaders of the community and the family, family history, to work out who gets what plot of land. But I do believe there is a project currently at the moment to formalise this.
And I think probably the final question that we have time for, how did you end up on this expedition? What was the instigation, and how did you get involved?
Mm-hmm. So I did my MA in social anthropology, and I already had a BA in archaeology, so I wanted to combine the two. Absolutely loved the Maya. For my MA dissertation fieldwork, I said, I want to go and live with the Maya to find out what archaeological reasons, what relationship that they have with the ancient Maya compared to the modern Maya. And I went. I was 23. I was probably a little bit naive, didn't really know what to expect. Getting off in a bus in the middle of the jungle, just jumping on a truck. But at the end of that path, there were this incredible Mayan community, and this expedition happened because I applied to the Scientific Exploration Society as an explorer, and they helped fund the expedition to actually go back and create these books.
Brilliant. Thank you, Charlotte, so much, and for sticking with a kind of a very distant internet connection. We really appreciate it. Okay, let's move on to our sixth talk of this evening. Wales has an extraordinary... Let me start again. Wales... Now we're talking about Wales. We were talking about Belize, now we're talking about Wales. Wales has an extraordinary range of landscapes, from mountains to pasture land, ancient forests to ancient villages. There's wildland and industrial heartlands. And it's got a surprisingly long coastline. 870 miles. That's 1,400 kilometres from Chepstow to Chester. And you can walk the whole distance on the Wales Coast Path, which is the first dedicated footpath in the world that covers the entire length of a country's coastline. I've walked a little bit of it on the Gower Peninsula. I can definitely recommend it. And after just 3 days, had a face like a kind of sideways Polish flag, frozen white on one side, spanked red by the wind on the other. It really was glorious, though, and I can definitely recommend it. But our next speaker didn't just do a few miles. She walked the whole thing, and in the course of that became the first woman to complete the route. Let's hear more. Please welcome Zoe Langley-Ruthven. Do you want me to speak? Hello. So Zoe's on mute. It sounded good, didn't it? Well, it looked good, but I don't know what she was saying. She was probably talking about Wales and walking. The tech team are going to try and get in touch with her and say, now you need to unmute because you're talking. But in the meantime, I'm just going to fill. I really recommend the Gower Peninsula. The Wales Coast Path is complete, as I said, 1,400 kilometres. And are you ready to go? They are. They're ready to go. Zoe's back. You don't want to hear from me. You want to hear from Zoe. Over to Zoe.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Sorry about that. So, next slide, please. Battling the most extreme elements I'd ever faced, the brutal 60-mile-an-hour headwinds fought against us along the 2 miles of Anglesey Beach, cruelly driving sand and rain into our faces with the force of a machine gun. I remember the stinging like needles, and I had to pull a buff up to my eyes to protect my face. At 60, it was Mike who worried me. His hands had turned from white to blue, and for the first time in 38 days of walking, he was ready to bail out. And Mike never gives up. Next slide. The Wales Coast Path is the world's first long-distance path dedicated to the full coastline of a country. And today I'd like to share with you how in just 43 days it shaped my view of Wales, its people, its landscape, its industry, and how it shaped me. Next slide. First, I think it's important for you to know where my decision to walk the Wales Coast Path came from. The previous year, I'd embarked on my very first long-distance hike, solo. The 630 miles of the South West Coast Path was nothing short of life-changing. And though it was supposed to be a one-off walk to mark my 40th birthday, it left me hankering after more adventure and the need to challenge myself further. Next slide. So back to the Wales Coast Path. When out walking, next slide, one might not consider the positive impact of people. Believe me, total strangers have that spirit-lifting power. It's magical. And 95 of these wonderful souls made it into my logbook. And please don't panic, I'm not about to list them all now. Severe blisters were wearing me down, and Menna and her Carmarthen outdoor shop colleagues treated us like absolute royalty, serving us hot drinks and chocolate eggs, whilst we rested in the leather tub chairs in the map section of their shop. Next slide. And then there were the three lads who came screeching up in their cars outside this bowling green next to the castle that we'd camped beside. It was 6 a.m. and we were having breakfast on the pavilion veranda. And I have to say my heart sank because I thought we were then in big trouble. Curiously, those lads had arrived there super early to do a naked photo shoot for a charity calendar. So with their bowling balls strategically placed, they proceeded to take their photos. And I don't mind admitting that my porridge might have lasted just a little bit longer that morning. Next slide. Mike and I wandered into a church on Anglesey. Perched high on a headland, we were greeted at the door by a lady of 91. With her stick at her side, more for poise than performance, she gracefully took us on a tour, just sharing her enthusiastic pride for the church's history and its anecdotes. And as we left, she was holding my hand and she whispered to me, "Godspeed and stay safe, dear." Her energy and passion absolutely touched us, and her name became our mantra for the rest of the walk. And whenever we were struggling, we would hold our hands in the air and exclaim, "Theodora Bullock, we love you." It just made us feel better. Next slide. So the diversity of the 870 miles of the Welsh coastline, next slide, conjures up images of beaches and promenades or rocky cliffs with the sea always in view. But the term coast path is perhaps a little misleading because although it keeps as close to the coast as possible, sometimes it has to weave inland through buildings, well, not through buildings, but between buildings and through woods, and then perhaps up an estuary to the nearest bridge. Next slide. Daily, I marvelled at the vulnerable headlands and the sheer geological miracles. Next slide. Many were hugged by a plethora of gulls, choughs and seals, and I'm delighted to report back that the wildlife on the Wales Coast Path is vibrantly present. Next slide. Northwards, I discovered the prize of standing on a beach stretching for miles, the sea to my left and the mountains of Snowdonia to my right. It was another world. And from here, I could actually see the mountains hiding the source of the rivers Wye and Severn, the Plyn-Limon range. Gave me bucket book ideas for another day. Next slide. Grateful for the varied terrain over 43 days of walking, I still had to dig deep. Roads, even beside the beauty of the salt marshes or the mountains, were a demanding walking surface and created tremendous heel pain with the constant impact of pavement pounding. There were nights where I would cry myself to sleep with the unbearable agony in my feet. Sand dunes, on the other hand, now they were a completely new adventure. And I wrote in my logbook, I've just climbed the biggest sand dune mountain near Three Cliffs Bay. And truthfully, it was just 2 large dunes. But going up was arduously slow. Coming down, that was a completely different ballgame. And if I closed my eyes, it felt like I could fly. Next slide. So Wales' industrial heritage is widely celebrated. Next slide. And what I noticed was that where industry has disappeared, tourism seems to have stepped up to help keep those communities afloat. And I'm sure that 9 years on, the Wales Coast Path itself has actually benefited the Welsh economy. Next slide. A camp spot with over 320 degrees of view is pretty impressive, and this is what we were offered by the lovely people at the Dale Fort Field Studies Centre. Built in 1856 to guard the waterway into Milford Haven, this historic landmark gave us much to be thankful for. Next slide. To reach it, we had to pass 2 out of the 3 oil refineries on the path, 1 out of the 8 power stations, and a liquid natural gas plant. And as we crossed one of the steel tunnel bridges at one refinery, I remember jumping a mile high with this voice that just boomed out of a loudspeaker. It just went, "Open up, sucker!" It was extra high security that year for 2012 Olympics. And I feared that this had been aimed at our walking buddy, Steve, for using his mobile phone too close to the refinery boundary. As it turned out, it was just a very cross, locked out security guard. Next slide. Milford Haven, Pembroke Docks and the surrounding water is vast. It's an industrial landscape on such a grand scale, and yet the neighbouring coastline is of such massive ecological importance and so beautiful. And thankfully, they seem to work together in harmony. Next slide. So at Dale Fort, we were offered beds, but we graciously declined, being on night 16 of a full run of 42 nights camping. Instead, we had the most amazing camp spot, drying room and shower. Next slide. And more good fortune. There happened to be a staff party at Dale Fort that night, and it was the funniest thing. A room full of glad rags and us, boogieing on down in our walking gear to Night Fever and air guitaring to Bohemian Rhapsody. What an incredible memory. Topped off with waking up to this spectacular view from our prime pitch. We were the luckiest campers alive. Next slide. So back in that storm on Anglesey's 2-mile stretch of sand at Cumron, knowing that Mike and his spirit was going downhill fast, I suggested that he stuffed his plastic survival bag underneath his coat to keep the wind out. It was a continual battle to stay upright, and there was no escape route off the beach. There was an active airbase behind us, RAF Valley. We watched the surfers, I remember, in utter disbelief, braving the almighty waves in the 60-mile-an-hour winds. Physically and emotionally spent, we rested at Rossnager, and after 2 hours, we carried on, packing 21 miles into our bags by the end of that day, over bog, estuary, fields, and beach. It was a true test of our strength. Next slide. Knowing that I was able to persevere and coach someone else through tough times taught me how much resilience I have, that we all have if we only know how to access it. And those were the early days of my personal journey, which led me to my current venture, Head Right Out, where I'm encouraging women to head out of their comfort zone and develop female resilience. Next slide. So Wales left me with lasting memories of personal kindness, wild beauty and tough environments. And while I learned heaps from these guys, the Wales Coast Path truly whipped me into physical and mental shape, sharing with me a quality I'll always carry. Next slide. The tenacity of a dragon that will not be broken. Thank you.
Brilliant, Zoe. Thank you so much. And sorry about the kind of false start. What was your favourite bit of the walk? And are there bits that you would like to go back and walk again, or are you done with the Wales Coast Path now?
I'm definitely not done with the Wales Coast Path, but I have been back since many times. There are so many exquisite areas. There are areas that are, even the industrial areas have points of interest for me. Walking around some of the power stations, I remember being quite surprised at how well the power station groups were looking after their environment. And they had them sort of set out as sites of special scientific interest. But yes, the Gower, absolutely stunning. And I managed to get down there in between lockdowns last year. Anglesey, beautiful. And there's something very rugged about Anglesey. And I think the Pembrokeshire Coast Path is so like the North Cornish Coast Path, which was the first long distance path, the Southwest Coast Path that I did the year before. So yes, there are lots of wonderful areas, and it's really hard to pick on a favourite, but I think I can group them into favourites.
Brilliant, thank you. A question, did you have rest days, or were you on the go every day? And was that part of the plan, or did you kind of work it out as you went?
It's a long time ago now. I don't believe we had any rest days. I think it was 43 days back to back. And there was one very long day, which was from Trevor to Menai, which is about 28 to 30 miles. I think it's about 30 miles. But a lot of that was like promenade. It was quite flat. But no, we didn't have any rest days. We planned it as we went, and because we were some of the first people to do it, I was the first woman to walk it, but I wasn't the first woman on the path. There was another lady before me that had done that, and it was very limited in terms of map information that we had to follow. And although there were signposts up, there weren't as many way markers as there are now. So it was very much a case of we kind of did it as we went and to see what would happen. I knew I had to be back for a certain time to get back to my job. I was a teacher. So we had that limit, but that was all.
Brilliant. And finally, tell us about your current project, Head Right Out. Tell us more.
Okay, so Head Right Out, it started off as a leap of faith from my teaching job into nothing. And I wanted to blog and encourage people, particularly women, to head out of their comfort zone, because what I'd noticed throughout my last 9-10 years of going on challenge walks, it is less about the walking and more about doing things that scare me, taking little risks, and facing those fears, those things that I perhaps didn't believe I could do. And that was the point with the Southwest Coast Path. For 15 years, I didn't think I could do it. And I waited, and I shouldn't have waited that long. And so now I'm really trying to encourage women that you really can do this, and you're going to feel a benefit, an internal benefit, if you just take that leap of faith and you just take that step forward. So yes, there is a link. I'm Head Right Out on all socials, so hopefully people will come along and have a chat to me.
Well, Zoe, thank you so much for sharing an inspiring walking journey across the whole length of Wales. We really appreciate it. You can talk more to Zoe, find out more about her project, and about how to take those first steps on a very long walk in the breakout rooms at the end of the evening. Okay, let's swiftly move on to our 7th speaker of the evening. Travel, we all agree, changes you. You often learn as much about yourself as you do the place you're exploring. Our current speakers so far have shown us that in spades. An expedition which pushes you into a new environment with new challenges, demanding new skills, and with an opportunity to contribute to better scientific understanding of a fragile ecosystem. Well, that has the potential to be life-shaping. Our next speaker is a geologist and physicist, a mountain leader, a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, and he's a teacher. And in 2019, he led a group of school students on an expedition to East Greenland. The plan: to trek 250 kilometres, climb almost the height of Everest, and to weigh the Earth. Let's hear more. Please welcome Dr. Richard Phillips.
Thank you, Marianne. Hello, everyone. Could I have the first slide, please? So I'm going to talk about an educational journey, an encounter between students, staff, and the wilderness of East Greenland that we took in the summer of 2019. Next slide. Our journey was inspired by Gino Watkins. Some of you may know about him. He was an Arctic explorer, and in the 1930s, he led a team of 14 to East Greenland with the idea of exploring the feasibility of putting in a air route between the UK and North America over the Greenland ice cap. And their base was in the Simliq Fjord of East Greenland. Next slide. From there, they would explore by plane, boat, and on foot, carrying out scientific research on the mountains, the ice cap, and the glaciers in the area. And our plan was to traverse East Greenland, summiting some of its many peaks and carrying out scientific research of our own. And I guess it was to be a traditional outdoor education experience in a wilderness setting. And it was going to be an experience, I hope, that would challenge and inspire the students in equal measure. However, the outcomes were perhaps a little bit more nuanced than I'd expected. Next slide, please. Our guided team consists of 4 members: Brad, an experienced mountaineer and former guide for the British Antarctic Survey; David, head of outdoor pursuits at the school, who had extensive experience in the mountains, including Everest and the Arctic; Jen, an outdoor pursuits instructor, who had expedition experience in Greenland already; and myself. I oversaw the logistics and planning and brought experience after organising expeditions in the Karakoram and the Sahara. We also had a team of advisors, both here and in Greenland, and I must mention a special mention to my former colleague Nigel Bidgood, who was instrumental in early planning of this expedition. Next slide. Our student team comprised 12 sixth formers aged 17 to 19, all of whom signed up for very different reasons, but all shared a sense of adventure and a desire to step out of their comfort zone. Next slide. So together we defined 3 projects: an Arctic flora baseline project, which consisted of botanical surveys from sea to summit, a geology project focused on understanding the regional geology, and a physics project aimed at determining the mass of the Earth. And for guidance, I told the physics team to go and read Eratosthenes and make use of solar noon on summer solstice, and I left it up to them to work it out. I gave some advice later. Next slide. In training, we met twice a week, once for physical training and once to learn some relevant expedition skills and understand more about Greenland. Next slide. As part of the training, we took a 6-day traverse of the Cairngorms during Easter, with a focus on self-sufficiency, teamwork, and skill development. Next slide. Carrying everything we would need, the students crossed rivers, climbed Munros, and practiced the use of ice axe and crampons. And our penultimate day, we headed down to our low-level final camp. But at 4 a.m. the next morning, we were awoken by concerned cries. Next slide. Our tents were near buried in over 1 metre of fresh snow. And with continued heavy snow and poor visibility, the staff team decided that it was time to break camp and get out. Over the 12-kilometre trail out, the students, without prompting from us at all, took it in turn to break trail, which is pretty tough going. And each leader stepped out when exhausted and high-fived everybody in the team. It was great to watch. And I knew then that they'd become a strong team and were ready for Greenland. Next slide. On the eve of the expedition, we were all packed up, excited and ready for an adventure. But sadly, news came that David was not able to travel to Greenland. So at 5 a.m. the next morning, as the students gathered for departure, David broke the news, and there was a palpable sense of sadness. But amazingly, the students all rallied around and ensured David and me that the trip would be a success. Next slide. We flew to Kulusuk off East Greenland via Reykjavik and transferred by helicopter to Masalyk Island, where we had a base in Tassilak. And from there, we took power boats to the north of the region to the head of the fjord in Ekasialak. And we had one food drop at Tinitakalak over about a 250-mile journey. What could possibly go wrong? Next slide. I remember being dropped off at the trailhead just here. You might be able to see our tents in that picture. And I remember standing at the shore watching the boats disappear, and we were left with an absolute silence. And I think at that time we recognized that we were very much alone. There was no noise, no hotels, no people, no mountain rescue, nothing. And we gathered up our belongings and set off for our first of many camps. Next slide. Whilst we had a guidebook to the trails, a very old one, it was evident that no trails actually existed. It was just a matter of reading the landscape and finding the path of least resistance. Each day we charted a course over bare rock, loose boulders and ice. And unfortunately, that terrain led to one accident, a suspected broken foot of a staff member who had to be evacuated by sea and air back to the UK. Our staff team was now reduced to just 2. Next slide. Our route was punctuated by many river crossings, and I have to say glacial water is unforgivingly cold, but we got used to it. And actually, due to some very warm weather we had that summer in Greenland, we came to find our river crossings mostly refreshing. Next slide. As we moved through the landscape, we were treated to some epic scenery, such as the Ekasatsivak fjord you can see here, separating Greenland from Ammassalik Island. Next slide. We also enjoyed some of the best campsites in the world. Next slide. When we made camp, we quickly got into a routine, usually revolving around food, not surprisingly. And we were also visited by occasional Arctic foxes who seemed to have a particular taste for chorizo sausage porridge and even the bowl that it was made in. Next slide. Food had to be dry, light, and add up to around 5,000 calories a day. So the food laid out here is about 4 days worth of food. Admittedly, if you look at that picture, most of the calories seem to be coming from chocolate and nuts. That's my bag, by the way. Next slide. So all of my kit, including medical supplies and some essential protection against polar bears, weighed in at around 35 kilograms. The student bag's around 30 kilograms. Next slide. And this made for some back-breaking work, resulting in some unconventional yoga poses for relaxation. Next slide. More conventional techniques were very welcome, courtesy of our expedition yoga coach, Jen. Next slide. We climbed many peaks, and this one was particularly exciting as it gave us a view of the vast Greenland ice sheet and the Sermelak fjord. And it was here that the students measured the mass of the Earth. Next slide. We had a gold DOV team, and they surveyed, as part of their project, flora at various elevations, laying down a baseline for future expeditions from the school to resurvey and analyse the impact of climate change on Arctic flora. Next slide. I'll spare you the maths, but the physics team managed to determine the circumference of the Earth and calculate its mass to within 1% of the published value, all with very simple equipment. Well done, guys. Next slide. And finally, after 21 days since arrival in Greenland, the team made it back to Tassalak, exhausted but elated and very much focused on unconstrained access to the local supermarket, I think. Next slide. During the trip, we covered over 260 kilometres, climbed within 500 metres of Everest, yet encountered no people and thankfully no bears on the trail. Next slide. We returned all of our safety equipment in Tassalak and then travelled by boat to Kulusuk Island for our flight home. We set up a final camp, and I tasked the students to go and explore the local area and return with a story or artefact for that evening. The idea being that it would open up a dialogue between themselves and the local hunters on the island. Next slide. They indeed returned with many enjoyable stories and artefacts, but one group, however, returned with more disturbing news. A polar bear had been spotted very nearby on an ice floe coming into the bay where we were. And I was given a gun by a hunter, a rifle, and told to stay awake all night. The students decided to make hourly shifts to keep me company, and we settled into our final challenge. The light dimmed, the sea mist rolled in, and we were left looking for a white animal on a white ice floe in a white mist. Luckily for us, that polar bear never materialised, but we had something of a tense night, I can say. But spending an hour with each student actually was really valuable because it gave an opportunity for me to discuss their expedition. And it was evident that whilst we had all trod the same path, everybody had had a very different journey. their thoughts, experience and outcomes were all diverse. Not only that, but I realised that we'd actually shifted our sense of place. When we'd originally set out on our adventure, I guess we'd unconsciously seen East Greenland as some venue, an arena for our adventure. But having remained immersed in the landscape for so long, unhindered by the distractions of everyday life, I guess, we'd in fact found a more sustainable view of living with the wilderness. I guess the Norwegians would call this friluftsliv, open air living. Next slide. Without doubt, I'd say we were profoundly affected by our trip, all of us, and it was certainly life-changing. I spoke to the students recently and all say that the expedition has certainly improved their sense of resilience and their ability to cope with challenges, particularly during lockdown and the uncertainty they now face. Next slide. Thank you to you as listeners, to the organiser of tonight's lectures, and also to the many people that helped us on our way. Thank you very much.
Richard, thank you so much. Questions already in. How did it feel? You described standing there as the boat disappeared with just silence. How did that feel? I mean, not only as a member of the expedition, but as, you know, a man with the well-being and safety of a whole group of young people on your shoulders.
Terrifying. No, well, it was a mixture of, you know, well, I guess we were pretty focused. So I think by the time we'd got on the boat and we'd travelled for a day up to the head of the fjord, we were the staff team were very focused, and yeah, there were some nerves. There always is at the back of your mind when you're on an expedition. But I think we all felt pretty confident. We had everything we needed. We had some good students with us. We were all well trained. So there was a little bit of nerves, but I'd say as that silence came, I felt actually quite calm and excited about the future.
How very exciting. How long did the whole trip take you?
So I think, well, we arrived in Tasselak and we were stormbound for about 2 or 3 days. And then we set off. I guess the whole thing took about 18 days, including the boat journey. And then we did some other peaks nearby. So we were there. The whole thing was around 26 days.
Fantastic. I've got loads of questions. How did you deal with the broken foot? Did you administer first aid? How did you? I'm assuming you had sat phones.
Well, we had a very big first aid pack. So we'd been on a ridge. This was the second day of being on a ridge, and we were heading south to Tinitakalak, which was our food drop. So we were about 3 or 4 hours away from the sea. We managed to get the guy off. He's a strong lad. He managed to walk off, but we did bandage him up and give him some compression. Luckily for him, his partner is a doctor, so he was able to phone home. But we essentially got the boat in early. We called Tasselak and they sent a boat round and picked him up and took him away.
And then
he wasn't happy.
And then you could get on with it.
Yeah.
Okay, the question, how much more accurate was your measurement of the mass of the Earth in Greenland than if you'd done it somewhere else, for example, in Scotland?
Oh, well, here's the secret. You can do it in your back garden, to be honest. So I won't go into the physics too much, but basically you need a pendulum and you need to work out the circumference of the Earth. So, and both of those things you can do anywhere in the world. You just need to know how far north you are from, if we're in the Northern Hemisphere, from the Tropic of Cancer, and you have to do something on summer solstice. You basically have to measure the angle subtended by the stick and the shadow where you are, because on summer solstice at solar noon, on the Tropic of Cancer there'll be no shadow.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm nodding. but I'm at the periphery.
Well, we can talk about it in the chat room, maybe,
Okay,
if anyone's interested.
And then finally, let's talk about funding. How did you fund this expedition, and how much were the students expected to contribute? How did the numbers work?
Gosh, well, the students were expected to contribute a lot, I'm afraid. So the help we got from supporters was mainly for the projects. So we had help from universities and the botanical gardens, who basically provided some training. And the rest of it was up to financially, it was up to the students to sort out. They had something like 2 years to get that money together. But everything was at cost price to them. As a school, we weren't making a profit from it, obviously.
Yeah, of course. Well, we have lots and lots of questions. I'm assuming that there are either lots of students who feel enormously inspired and fired up and want to go on a trip similar to the one that you led, or teachers going, wait, how do I do that? So please do stick around at the end of the evening, and you'll be able to speak to Richard, and you'll be able to pick his brains. There you go. Richard, thank you so much for your time. Thank you. Okay, folks, we are at the final talk of this evening, and it is definitely worth waiting for. What happens when you're in your early 20s and then you suffer a spinal injury that spells an end to a sports career and many long-held dreams? How do you find the balance then between accepting a new reality but still pushing for the adventurous, challenging life you enjoyed before? Well, one option is to plan a trip. A cycling trip, perhaps. How about 5,500 miles through 19 countries from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea, following the route of the Iron Curtain, the frontier of the former Soviet Union? Our next speaker did exactly that. Please welcome Laura Scott.
Hi, thanks, Marianne. My name's Laura, and it's my pleasure and my challenge to try and summarise almost 6 months of cycle touring across a whole continent in the next 10 minutes. So the story starts in 2015. I was 24 years old, and as I suspect might be the case with a lot of adventures, I was pretty fed up. A spine injury had just ended my hopes of a sports career, and after quite a lot of intense, unsuccessful treatment, I'd been told that I could expect to be in pain for the rest of my life, to have intermittent use of my left hand and my left leg, and that I would most likely struggle to be physically capable of holding down a job. I'm delighted to say that those latter two in particular have turned out not to be true. I have almost full mobility back, and I now have a great career. But at the time, things were looking pretty bleak. Somehow I found my way onto a bike. I should clarify that I wasn't a cyclist before I went into this. I was a hammer thrower. So it was a pretty big change of direction. But I found that even on the days where I was struggling to walk, I was often still able to pedal, even if it was pretty slowly and mostly with my right leg. But I found that actually I was still able to find a way to be physical and to be adventurous. And it was wildly exciting for someone that had just had that taken out of their life. And so sometime later, a housemate of mine mentioned something called cycle touring. And I was one quick Google away from learning what it was and setting myself an adventure. And this is what it was. Next slide, please. I cycled 9,000 kilometres, or 5,600 miles, from Barents Sea, 300 miles north of the Arctic Circle, down to the Black Sea on the Turkish-Bulgarian border. I passed through some incredible history, both in the Second World War and the Cold War, and also got to see some bucket list items such as the Midnight Sun. About 3/4 of my route was on tarmac. The rest was a slightly bumpy mix of gravel, dirt tracks, and even some sand, which was pretty challenging on a bicycle. Fully loaded, my bike with supplies and food and drink and my equipment weighed about 45 kilos, which is apparently the average weight of a 13-year-old child. If you've ever tried to give a backie to a 13-year-old child for any great distance, you'll know that once you get up to speed, it's more or less okay. But that starting, stopping, steering and changing directions become disproportionately challenging. Next slide, please. So what does 9,000 kilometres look like? Well, it's roughly the same straight line distances from London to Johannesburg, or Rio, LA, Hanoi, or Seoul. Next slide, please. So it was a decent challenge for a girl with a bad back. Setting off, I figured I had about a 1 in 3 chance of success. I thought there was probably a 1 in 3 chance that, given that I hadn't done a major cycle tour before, I wouldn't be logistically up to the challenge, that there might be something I hadn't foreseen. And I thought that no matter how much I looked after my back, there was still probably a 1 in 3 chance that it might cause me to need to go home prematurely. So I really did have to be willing to risk failure on this. As you probably guessed by the fact that I'm speaking to you today, I didn't fail. And here's how it went. Next slide, please. So shortly before midsummer in 2015, I flew to Kirkenes in northeast Norway, ready to start with my toes in Barents Sea at Grense-Jakobslev. Next slide. Things didn't start brilliantly. My rear wheel got broken on the flight, and I had to post it 1,000 miles to Oslo, which was the nearest place that there was someone that was capable of mending it. With no wheel, my partner at the time, who very kindly had come with me for the first week to see me off, and I were pretty stuck. Things seemed a little bit disappointing, but incredibly, moments after posting the wheel, we bumped into Xavier, a local cycling enthusiast who not only drove us to our start point at Grense-Jakobslev, but left me his mother-in-law's bike, the keys to his remote cottage to be dropped off with him when we finished the leg to Kirkenes, as well as a couple of beers, a pack of biscuits, and a dried reindeer heart for dinner. It was a pretty good way to start. Next slide, please. Eventually, the bike was back together, and alone again, I cycled into a routine of cycle touring. I had a tiny tent, a stove, 4 fastidiously packed pannier bags, and became very familiar with wet dry drills and long-distance wayfinding. Next slide, please. People often ask if I was afraid, travelling and camping alone in remote locations, and I was. I slept with a knife and an emergency tracking device to hand every night, and there were a couple of close calls, but overall people were amazingly kind. The picture on the left shows the result when a lady stopped and questioned me about whether I was alone and if I'd ever been to that area before. I was pretty cagey at first. If you are alone and have never been to a place before, the last thing you want a stranger to know is that fact. However, eventually I decided that this lady and her 2 small toddlers were unlikely to be Mad Axe murderers and agreed to go to their home. This lady and her husband turned out to be Sami reindeer herders and incredibly invited me to join them on an amazing herding expedition to mark the new reindeer calves that involved me being thoroughly outskilled by large groups of children. The picture on the right shows the outcome when one night I heard someone rustling in the plastic that I used to keep my bike waterproof. I started screaming blue murder and poked my head out of the tent in time to see someone running away into the night. I felt very proud of myself for protecting my precious bike, right up until the next morning when I realised that this person had been putting a small bag of sweets into the frame of my bike for me to find the next day as a surprise. I felt pretty stupid. Next slide, please. So for all my fears, the entire trip was marked by astonishing kindness from friends, family, strangers. And it's more than I could possibly do in the time available to go through each of them. So I hope they will forgive me simply for saying that I was incredibly touched. I also learned to always join a queue if I found one, because whoever and whatever was at the front was usually pretty good fun. Next slide, please. And I was also finding it possible to manage my spine. I'd had some adjustments made to my bike before I started. I had figure-of-8 handlebars to give me as many back positions as possible, and some springs put into the seat to try and reduce any bumps. But I still found that I had a few issues from time to time, and occasionally was left stranded until I was able to move more freely again. The quote is from one of my brothers, who, with typical brotherly bluntness, decided to point out that even though I'd managed to cycle over 1,000 miles at the time, I still wasn't able to walk particularly well or bend over successfully to pick up an item from the floor. The cycling also temporarily worsened some problems with my hands, and there were some stretches where I couldn't really use them and had to use my teeth and forearms instead. Sometimes this led to interesting consequences. For example, as a treat, I checked myself into a hotel for my 25th birthday and it had a spa, which I thought would be great for easing my back. All was going well until I realised I absolutely couldn't turn the key to open my locker with all of my clothes in it. And I had to summon help from a passing stranger who didn't speak English using naked charades. Next slide, please. Approaching Russia, I entered a wonderful section along the Baltic with company. My brother Henry joined me, who spent his 19th birthday cycling 100 miles into St. Petersburg, into the worst headwind I've ever seen in my life, with both of us having to bail off the truck roads into the undergrowth each time a lorry came along, as they did not want to wait to overtake. He was also a healthy reminder that no matter what you're doing, there's always someone better, as you can see from the photo on the right. Next slide, please. My parents and my brother Felix also joined us in Tallinn for some more wonderful group cycling and stunning island hopping along the Baltic. This section also involved a very unexpected trip with my father to Sweden, as the delayed start meant that my Russian visa had expired before I could get through Kaliningrad, and we had to be very creative about finding a way round. People often ask about how my parents reacted when I said at the age of 24 that I wanted to do this trip by myself. They were pretty amazing. They had two questions. The first was, is it safe? I answered, ish. And they said, have you made up your mind? I told them that they had power of veto, but if they said yes, I was going to do it, or at least try. There were, however, some stories I didn't tell my mum until after they were done. These included having to go through uncleared landmine territory in Croatia, and also having to vault and cross a mercifully quite quiet Russian motorway, lifting bikes and jumping over the central reservations, both myself and my brother, because I'd accidentally taken a wrong turn, and having to go back the other way would have involved a 200-kilometre detour. It seemed worthwhile at the time. Next slide, please. At this stage, I'd reached about halfway through my trip. So by the time I got to Poland and Germany, and it was rapidly becoming clear that this was something I actually could do. The main concern was just the fact that I was going to have to cycle all that distance over again. By and large, things were going well. Although it was in Germany that I experienced my first truly hungry day. On one particular day, I found it quite easy to get supplies up until that point. But when I was going through the mountains, I found that I wanted to carry less food and just buy it as I went along. And one particular Sunday, I reached a rural part of Germany where there was no food whatsoever. All the shops were shut. And I had to do my 100 kilometres of constant hills and mountains that day using the only food I had available, which was the last bit of a very small pot of jam, maybe about 1 or 2 centimetres. And I squeezed my remaining water into it, shook it up, and had a teaspoon of diluted jam every half hour for the remainder of the day. Next slide, please. In Germany, I encountered some extraordinary history, dotting either side of the East-West division, passing memorials, checkpoints, former concentration camps, and even a house which literally had been split in two by partition. The bottom right 2 pictures, however, sadly, are from the EU migrant crisis. It was shocking to see how similar some of the infrastructure was to the memorials, for example, with the barbed wires and the watchtowers. The crisis made some of the border crossings a little bit tricky for me, but most of all, I was overwhelmed by how privileged I was to be able to cross through so many borders unchallenged while thousands of people were risking everything to travel the other way. Next slide, please. I got to the beautiful Danube and was glad of the flat terrain I also started needing an anti-dog device as I started getting chased by literally hundreds of dogs a day. I'm not sure if it helped having a whistle on my jumper, but it certainly gave me something to do while I was being chased. Next slide, please. With the terrain becoming hilly again, I'd passed through some major mountain ranges, including the Harz, Carpathian and Balkan. I started struggling on some of the hills. As you can see from the bottom right, on one occasion, regularly, this is just an example, I had 30 kilometres of constant climbing in one go. And one of the towns that I was planning to spend the evening in, I saw on a road sign was more commonly accessed by ski lift. Fortunately, at the same time, my wonderful aunt and uncle were with me. They kept me incredibly well fed and helped me to execute a radical change of plan. Next slide, please. Really keen to get home by Christmas, I decided to downsize, getting rid of my tent for the last month and banking on my ability to reach my target destination to find lodging each night or to cycle into the night as long as it took to do so. I was able to therefore to power on through Serbia, Romania, Macedonia, Bulgaria and Greece. Next slide, please. Until finally I reached the Black Sea. It was incredible to reach my goal and did feel like a big achievement, but in many ways I was sad that the journey was over. As my friend who first introduced me to cycle touring said, it's basically just trading in all of your problems for a totally different set of problems. And as it turned out, that different set of problems was exactly what I needed. Next slide. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to taking your questions.
What a lovely way to finish, that you're trading in a different set of problems, but that's exactly what you needed. How wonderful. Questions already in, but my first question is, at the very beginning of your talk, Laura, which was genuinely wonderful, you mentioned a dried reindeer heart. How did that taste? What did you do with it? Favourite delicacy now?
I mean, I eat pretty much anything, and you're very hungry when you've been cycling. It was quite gamey. and took a lot of chewing.
Gamey. There you go. There you go, folks. I know you were wondering. I'm sure there's a recipe online. Someone says, Joe Smith, the director of the RGS, says, you mentioned being drawn into a little like reindeer herding. Every leg of a cycle tour like this must throw up so many tempting and distracting diversions. So how did you decide when to take advantage of that pace between, you know, being your own master, and when to press on with the journey?
That's a great question. Up until at the end, where I really wanted to make sure I was getting home by Christmas, I had a fairly flexible schedule, although there were a few moments where I knew that, you know, if I don't wake up this morning and go now, I'm going to be a day late for someone in a month's time when I want to reach such and such a city. But in general, I tried to take advantage of opportunities as and when they arose. You know, I joined in a local haystack building competition. I took a train to Berlin so that I could cycle around the Western Berlin section of the Iron Curtain as well. I was really keen to get involved. I'm unlikely to cycle that exact route again, so I wanted to make the most of it.
Where would you recommend someone who, Thomas says, where would you recommend someone starts to plan such a long bike tour?
Doing a lot of research is obviously helpful. Finding blogs and reading books about people that have done similar expeditions. One of my favourite books that I read recommended that ice cream was the perfect cycling food, which I took to heart. But ultimately, I mean, physically it's a huge challenge. Logistically, it's a huge challenge. You learn it en route. I think to give people courage, if they did want to do something like this, have a go. Your fitness will improve and your confidence will improve as you go.
How long did it take you, the whole journey?
5.5 months. I wasn't fast.
No, to be fair, wait, you did 5,500 kilometres. That sounds pretty fast.
No, 9,000 kilometres, 5,500 miles.
Oh yeah, 5,500 miles. That's what I meant. Yeah. No, that'll do, Laura. You're doing fine. Tell us a bit more about your bicycle. Do you still have it? And what was the kind of, you know, in not too technical detail, the specifications?
Yeah, of course. I literally walked into Brixton Cycles and said that I wanted a bike that would take me a really long way if maybe I didn't have a good back and wasn't a bike mechanic. And sat down with the guy that was there and we designed it from there. So I, as I mentioned, I have a Surly disc trucker for those that are particularly interested. It's made of steel, which makes it really heavy, but it also makes it really easy to mend when you're en route. I had phenomenal tyres. I genuinely, no one ever believes this, I didn't get a single puncture. I got through the entire tyres several times and had to get new tyres, but I didn't burst a single inner tube, which is insane. And I had a roll-off disc hub, which meant that all of my gears were in the hub in the rear wheel, which is why it was such a disaster when that wheel broke. And the nearest person on the flight and the nearest person that could mend it was in Oslo.
Brilliant. Did your journey change your approach to fear, safety, or confidence?
Yes. I took safety seriously. There were a couple of incidents en route that were particularly challenging, and I had a tracker with me. You know, I have a responsibility to myself and the people I care about to keep me safe. Having said that, the vast majority of my time that I was afraid, I was in no danger whatsoever. I think if you're by yourself, it's incredibly easy to blow something totally out of proportion in your head. When I was in Serbia, I knew almost nothing about Serbia other than the fact that there had been a war there a long time ago. And I remember being in a particularly rural area and seeing two men with guns up in the distance. You know, it's very high, it's a tiny path and very, very high crops on either side of me. And all I could think of was the fact that, well, obviously this was the start of the next conflict and, you know, I was just going to have to accept my fate. And actually it was totally ridiculous. They were just two farmers that waved to me as I went past. So my own fear was certainly a bigger issue than any genuine threat to me. And I think that's been something I've tried to carry through.
And if you had one piece of advice to someone who's feeling the itch in their pedal feet, listening to you, what would it be?
Oh, go for it. And don't bother cycling if it's raining. That would be my advice.
Well, there we go. Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much. We have lots more questions about future routes, plans, how to plan. You'll be sticking around in the breakout rooms, I'm assuming? Okay, fantastic. So, folks, if you have more questions for Laura or any of our other 7 speakers, please do stick around and join us in the Zoom breakout rooms, which will be starting very, very shortly. Well, we've come to the end of another year of micro lectures, and I hope you'll agree with me that even though it's a different format and we're not all in the same room, surrounded by the names of great explorers and geographers at the Ondaatje Lecture Theatre in Kensington, it's been just as enlightening, just as inspiring, and it certainly made me, I don't know, feel kind of happy about having not gone anywhere apart from my own postcode for months and months and months, but also hungry for the world to reopen. Thank you to all our speakers for sharing their stories, for their generosity and honesty. Thank you to the organisers on the Younger Members Committee, Rupert, Keith, Eve and Rebecca. They work tirelessly to bring this event to us every year. Thank you to Mitchell and the Society's events team, and Luciano and Alfredo on the AV team. They are fantastic. And a reminder, of course, I mean, I have said this to you a lot, don't go away. You're allowed to go for a week, you're allowed to go and get another drink, maybe put your even comfier slippers on, but do join us, the speakers, myself, other members of the audience in the virtual map room. So the bar at the RGS is called the map room. So we're calling these the virtual map room, but basically they're Zoom breakout rooms. They are starting right now. The speakers are going to be in their various breakout rooms, so you can have a chance to chat, ask those questions, talk to other members of the audience. There is a button to click to join that breakout room just below me. So scroll up or down, scroll down the page. There's a Q&A box, and then there's a button to click to join the Zoom link. And also the Zoom meeting code and the passcode are going to now be posted into the Q&A box as well. So if you prefer to join using the passcode and the meeting code, then they will be visible to you now on this same webpage. Finally, applications to speak next year are now open. The deadline is the end of October. So if you have a geographical journey that you would like to share with an audience that is literally worldwide, please do. I would urge you to look up the details and apply to be a speaker at next year's micro lectures. Thank you very much and good night, and I shall see you in those breakout rooms very shortly.